Hello, Algebra 2 students. Today we're going to learn about complex numbers. So the question we're going to learn today or talk about is, what is I? So let's start with this. We've been working over the last few days. What is the square root of 4? Well, we know the square root of 4 is 2. But why is the square root of 4 2? Well, we know because when we take the square root, we ask ourselves, what number times itself gives you the number under the radical? So what's the square root of negative 4? And you're thinking to yourself, well, 2 times 2 is 4. Negative 2 times negative 2 is 4. So what number times itself gives you a negative? And the answer is nothing. So we introduced today a new notation for I. I equals the square root of negative 1. By defining I as the square root of negative 1, this will allow us to take the square root of negative numbers. So let's take a look. The square root of negative 4, if we break it apart into this negative 1 times 4, we can use our properties of radicals that says if terms are being multiplied, we can separate them. So the square root of negative 1 times 4 equals I times 2, or 2I. We always write the number first and the I second, just like with variables. So let's take a look at a couple more. Okay. Before that, we also need to define that the square root of negative 1 squared is negative 1. So let's try the square root of negative 9. We break it apart into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9, and we get I times 3, or 3I. How about the square root of 108? Well, we ask ourselves, what perfect squares are in 108? So we start with our calculator, we start finding perfect squares that will divide into 108, and when I do that I find 36. And I can rewrite this as the square root of negative 1 times 36 times 3. I can break that apart, square root of negative 1, square root of 36, and the square root of 3. Terms that get to come out, the negative 1 comes out as I. Square root of 36 is 6, so I get 6I root 3. Okay, going on, we're going to take a look at higher powers of I. So we know I to the first is I squared is negative 1, which we saw earlier. What's I cubed and I to the fourth, or what's I to the 100th? Okay, so remember that I cubed really means I times I times I, well, which is the same as, if I group these two together, I squared times I, and I squared is negative 1. So negative 1 times I is just negative I. Well, we could use the same idea for I to the fourth. This is I times I times I times I. If we group these two and these two together, I get I squared times I squared. And I squared is negative 1, so negative 1 times negative 1 is 1. Let's do some more. How about I to the fifth? Well, we could keep writing them out, okay, but this would take a while. So what if I take I times I to the fourth? And can I rewrite I to the fourth as I squared? Well, let's try. I times I squared squared. So let's take a minute and look at what I did. I broke apart I to the fifth as I times I to the fourth. I wanted an even power here. And then I rewrote I to the fourth as I squared squared, because remember, power to a power you multiply. So far, equivalent expressions. Well, what happens when I put in I squared? I know I squared is negative 1, so I have I times negative 1 squared. Well, negative 1 squared is just 1, so I have I. I can do the same thing with I to the 6th, except for 6 is already even, so I don't have to pull out that single I. So I can rewrite this as I squared cubed. Again, power to a power you multiply, so I squared cubed is still I to the 6th. I squared is negative 1 to the 3rd power is negative 1. Alright, let's try it again. I have an odd power this time, so I have I times I to the 6th. And I'm going to rewrite that as I times I squared cubed. So I times negative 1 cubed. Well, negative 1 to an odd power gives me negative I. And the same thing with I to the 8th. Again, notice even power, so I don't need to factor out the I can just rewrite this as I squared to the 4th power. Negative 1 to the 4th gives me 1. You should be looking across here, noticing I to the 1st and I to the 5th equal I. I squared, I to the 6th, negative 1. Can we start thinking about a pattern there? Let's try it again. I to the 9th. I could rewrite this as I times I to the 8th, and that would give me I times I squared to the 4th. So negative 1 to the 4th power is an even number, or excuse me, is a positive number, so I get I. I to the 10th. I squared to the 5th, or negative 1 to the 5th gives me negative 1. I to the 11th. I times I to the 10th, or I times I squared to the 5th, which is I times negative 1 to the 5th, or negative I. And last but not least, I to the 12th. I could do I squared to the 6th, negative 1 to the 6th is 1. So hopefully you see every 4th number we are going through this rotation of I, negative 1, negative I, 1. Okay. Some people like to practice like the factors of 4. Depends on how you see it. I each time will rewrite it as a product of I squared. I think it's easiest to see your answer that way. So if I look at I to the 16th, I have I squared to the 8th. Again, power to a power, so 2 times 8 is my 16. Negative 1 to the 8th is 1. Or I to the 20th. I squared to the 10th. Negative 1 to the 10th is also 1. But what if I did something crazy like I to the 201? Okay, again, we would need to see, you could divide by 4 and see what your remainder would be where you fall into this pattern, or we could just simply rewrite it. I times I to the 200. I factored out the I because this was an odd power. I times I squared to the 100. 2 times 100 is 200. And I get I times negative 1 to the 100. Well, negative 1 to an even power gives me 1. So just I. So it's up to you on how you think about it, but you might want to think about the pattern versus factoring out the I or rewriting it. It's up to you. So let's check out, I had some, ignore those. Here we go. This is what I want you to do tonight. So on the left hand side you've got some radicals. Simplifying radicals with negative, watch out if there's no negative, just like we did the other day. And then some I to the higher powers. Okay, so practice those, and tomorrow we will go over them in class and see if you have any questions. Thanks for watching the video.